Bom, gostaria de dar mais uma vez boa noite a todos, né? Já foram todos saudados pela mesa anterior, mas vão as minhas saudações também. Agradecer a presença de todos. Dizer que para nós do INEAC é uma grande satisfação poder contar mais uma vez com a presença do professor Oj Bisharat, que já esteve aqui outras vezes. Há cerca de 2 anos atrás, ele fez uma conferência muito interessante, depois publicada em Dilemas, sobre o plea bargaining. E hoje ele vai falar sobre raça e racismo no sistema de justiça criminal americano. O professor George, ele fez a graduação dele em Berkeley, na Universidade da Califórnia, em antropologia. Depois fez um mestrado em História na Georgetown University. Concluiu o doutorado dele em Antropologia em Harvard em 87 e também fez o curso de Direito em Harvard também, nesse mesmo período. Depois trabalhou um tempo como defensor público em São Francisco. E, se não me engano, em 91... Defender. Public defender. Não, defensor público. Okay. Public defender.
Translator.
Okay. No problem. Mas, bom, em 91, ele passou a ser professor no Hastings College of the Law, que é a faculdade de direito mais antiga da Califórnia. E é professor, inclusive o plea bargaining é um dos temas sobre os quais ele leciona, mas ele tem colaborado muito conosco também em estimulando um diálogo com pesquisadores palestinos. O George é de origem palestina e publicou um livro. Eu perdi a anotação do título do livro que eu tinha aqui, mas o tema do livro, de todo modo, é sobre advogados palestinos sob o domínio de Israel. É um livro que teve uma repercussão razoável. Com essas palavras, eu passo, então, a palavra para o George. Obrigado, George. Thanks.
Test. Well, thank you so much, Luis, Lenny, Roberto. It is always a great pleasure to come to Niterói and to be with all of my good friends. If you don't believe me, then come to the party later. I've composed a song called Down to Niterói. You won't want to miss it. It's a special honor to be with you today to open this conference and also to speak about a topic that has preoccupied me really since my youth, and namely, that is the frustrating persistence of racial inequalities in the American criminal justice system. It was impossible to grow up in the United States in the era that I did and not be aware of this issue. I was 10 years old, living in Southern California when the Watts riots broke out, triggered by a police stop of an African-American man. And of course, we have seen periodically through the years, every 5 to 10 years, almost like clockwork, similar civil unrest over perceptions, if not the reality, of unequal treatment by police of people of color. Only the most recent in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, after the killing of Michael Brown, which I'm sure some of you probably read about. Also, Luis mentioned my experience as a public defender. The reality of this inequality was underscored for me when I was beginning to start training to handle felony crimes. I had been in the Office of the Public Defender for about a year doing misdemeanor defense. And when I was sufficiently experienced, they moved me up. And my first bit of training was simply to follow a more experienced felony attorney around and observe for several days. So one day I was sitting in the Superior Court in San Francisco, and I watched arraignments, the arraignment calendar. So there's a special period of the court when all it does is to read charges to people who have just been arrested and have just been brought into the system, and the arraignment is the term for their first appearance in court. So I watched somewhere between 22 and 25 arraignments in felony court. Every single one of the defendants was African American. This is in a city with an African American population of 6%. This, as you may know as well, San Francisco is a famously liberal, progressive city. It is a city that prides itself on tolerance and acceptance. So, you know, how could this be? How could we have this stark inequality? Unfortunately, almost wherever you go in my large country, north, south, east, west, there is substantial evidence to show that racial minorities suffer discrimination in all stages of their encounters with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. When people of color, and by that usually we mean African Americans and Latinos, when they are surveilled, they are more likely to be stopped. When they are stopped, they are more likely to be searched. When they are searched, they are more likely to be arrested. When they are arrested, they're more likely to be charged, and they are more likely to be charged with more serious offenses. And the evidence of discrimination carries through virtually every phase of a criminal prosecution, up to and including the ultimate sanction of death. Now, there is nothing deliberately comparative about my talk today, but I am aware, of course, that Brazil may have similar problems. I share our experience in the United States with you, counting on you to draw the parallels and the distinctions as necessary. While we may have similar problems, I don't imagine that they would be identical. I want to do 5 things in my talk today. First, I want to briefly spend time presenting evidence that racial inequalities, which have historically characterized our system of criminal justice in the United States, continue to exist in the current period. I won't spend much time because I believe that this is actually not a controversial claim. This is a paradox, in a sense, in an age of colorblindness. I'll explain what I mean by that. But the next 3 parts then of my presentation will look at possible explanations for what we see for this appearance of racial inequality. The first is that poverty is actually the real issue, and I'll explain. The next is that what we really are seeing is the consequence of our so-called war on drugs. And finally, I'll look at the possibility that mass incarceration is what some authors have called a new Jim Crow. That is to say, it is a system of maintaining white supremacy. These explanations are overlapping and not mutually exclusive, and just because one may be true in part does not mean that the others are not also true. In fact, in my view, each of these explanations has a kernel of truth. but also possibly some weaknesses. Ultimately, however, it's my conclusion that the third and last of these explanations is the most persuasive, even if it is the most disturbing. And by that, again, just to repeat, mass incarceration is a form of maintaining white supremacy, a mechanism for maintaining white supremacy. So the fifth and final part, I will talk about the consequences of this stubborn reality of racial inequality and refer to some possible ways forward. So, starting with the first. It is not controversial to state that the criminal justice system functioned as a tool of racial domination in the early United States, most obviously and directly during the period of slavery, which only formally ended in the mid-19th century following and as a consequence of our Civil War. Prior to that time, we had separate slave codes that were draconian in nature, that authorized terrible punishment based on absolutely trivial offenses, and which generally consecrated in law a variety of forms of inequality. It is also not controversial to say that that these inequalities persisted, although in different form, in the era of Jim Crow. Now, that term may be unfamiliar to you. Jim Crow was a popular song of the mid-19th century, which essentially mocked African Americans as stupid, as incompetent, as unworthy of rights of citizenship. And the era of Jim Crow, that name stuck and became the name for the set of laws and practices of generally state governments, mostly in the southern United States, but not exclusively there, to maintain white privilege in an era of following the Civil War through segregation, housing segregation, that is, voting restrictions, and highly unequal treatment in criminal law. All of this, despite the post-Civil War passage of the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, which mandates that the states must provide equal protection to all persons and may not discriminate on the grounds of race or other. There was a long history through this period of police brutality against people of color. We had vigilantism, in other words, citizens who were exerting violence against African Americans without punishment, lynchings. We had the notorious Ku Klux Klan, which was engaged in a lot of these activities. The level of violence and brutality that was visited against African Americans in this period is horrific. This period, the Jim Crow period, didn't really end until the middle of the 20th century with a variety of important U.S. Supreme Court decisions and with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, at least until recently, there was a fairly wide perception in the United States that gradually, since the end of the Jim Crow period, we had turned a corner as a nation. And for many people, this was exemplified in the election, not just once, but twice, of an African-American man, Barack Obama, as president of the United States. How much more visible a symbol of, the age of colorblindedness could we have? Now, the main front in the ongoing civil rights struggle for the last 4 decades or so has been affirmative action, that is the effort to promote opportunities for African Americans and other people of color in education, employment, housing, and the like. But for anyone who truly wanted to pay attention, the problems of racial inequalities in the criminal justice system never disappeared. The evidence, as I said, is incontrovertible that people of color suffer the consequences of criminal law enforcement disproportionately. Much could be said here. There's a lot of evidence that one could look at, but let's skip to the bottom line, by which I mean incarceration rates, the kind of the end point of the criminal justice system. In the US today, 60% of all people incarcerated are people of color. That is, as I said, African American or Latinos. While they constitute just 30% of the US population. The rate of incarceration of blacks is 6 times that of whites. 1 in 9 black kids has a parent, usually a father, currently in jail. The incarceration rates of Latinos is 2.5 times that of whites. So the question is, how do we explain the fact that racial minorities are jailed so disproportionately in an age of colorblindness? So I told you I was going to give you, 3 possible explanations or hypotheses explaining this disproportionality. The first is that poverty is, or social class, is actually the real problem. The idea here is that when we look at incarceration rates and we see disproportionate rates of people of color, it's like an optical illusion. And what we are really looking at is the influence of poverty, not race. Poor people simply don't fare as well in our criminal justice system as wealthy people. And it so happens that poverty rates among blacks and Latinos are considerably higher than among whites. In 2010, for example, 27.4% of blacks and 26.6% of Hispanics or Latinos were poor, compared to 9.9% of non-Hispanic whites and 12.1% of Asians. These are US government figures. Now, to consider this explanation seriously, let's consider. So there are possible dimensions to this explanation. First of all, poor people commit more crimes, especially property crimes. That's intuitively plausible. But if you take into account software piracy, financial fraud, environmental crimes, and the like, it's probably not true. And in terms of the amounts at stake, really represent a pittance. Okay, so, well, maybe poor people commit more street crimes and violent crimes that impact public security and arouse community fears and therefore attract police attention. This could be. There is statistical evidence that African American men, young men especially, are disproportionately involved in violent crime. Also, in a slight variation, maybe poor people commit more crimes in public and therefore are more easily apprehended by law enforcement. Their offenses are simply more visible. The wealthy white lawyer snorts cocaine that is, in his office, as opposed to doing it out on the street corner. And so, the poor people who are out there doing, living their lives partly in the streets are simply the low-hanging fruit, the ones who are most easily, most vulnerable to law enforcement. That's also worth considering. Lastly, when rich and poor face prosecution, they do so with vastly unequal resources. And there's much to say here as well that I don't have time to go into, but rich people are able to minimize punishment or escape it altogether through a variety of uses of resources. And one case that seemed to bring all of this together was the trial of Oj Simpson. This was in the mid-90s, a U.S. football star, our kind of football, which I know is not really football at all, was arrested and tried for the murder of a young man and his former wife. And the evidence was fairly compelling that, in fact, he was guilty, but he hired what was called the dream team of lawyers, very, including my former criminal procedure or criminal law professor from Harvard, and he was found not guilty by a jury. So here was an African-American man who happened to have great resources and great wealth, and therefore was able to escape punishment. There is, however, a lot of evidence that if you take class or economic resources out of the picture, that race continues to be a factor. This is true of, so-called new policing, or community policing, which I'm sure many of you have read about and are familiar with. With its use of statistical metrics to direct police resources and its emphasis on aggressive intervention to enforce petty crime and nuisance violations. So the statistical evidence for this form of policing shows equal disproportion. So file this possibility away, that is that, it's really poverty, not race, that we're talking about here, as a possibility, but with some contradictory evidence. The next hypothesis is that what we're really looking at is the effects of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was really declared, it was kicked off by the first President Bush in the late 80s. And this explanation, like the first one, is that racial inequality is kind of an optical illusion. That's not really what's going on. Blacks happen to be swept up in inordinate or disproportionate numbers because of their drug use. The crack epidemic, crack cocaine epidemic, swept urban America in the 80s and the 90s of the last century. And the concern over crack led to a sentencing crackdown with mandatory minimum sentences that were quite lengthy. And there were a whole set of associated problems, gang warfare over trafficking territory in cities like Washington, D.C., and Oakland, near where I live, became like war zones. The main problem with this explanation is that drug use rates were not significantly different between races. In fact, the highest rates of drug consumption were actually among white teens and white professionals, including the consumption of crack cocaine, this drug that was supposed to be particularly dangerous and addictive. So if that's, if that's the case, maybe it's the fact of the associated crimes, particularly violent ones, that were part of the crack cocaine epidemic. If, if we're taking this view, if African Americans had consumed drugs in the privacy of their homes and offices, like white professionals, and paid for their addiction out of their earnings rather than out of robberies and other street crimes, then incarceration rates may never have gotten out of whack. There may be some validity to this. But again, like the first hypothesis, the evidence is equivocal, and there's reason to believe there's reason to believe that there may be some truth here, other evidence suggesting doubt. And it must be acknowledged that the very idea of a war, on an internal war, had racial overtones from the start. Compare a different example, the contemporary response to our so-called opioid crisis, which has afflicted many rural white communities in recent years in the United States, and which was a major issue in our healthcare debate, with many Republican politicians, people from the Republican Party, generally a party that, our right, more to the right party, and one which has supported law and order. Many Republican politicians were holding out for funding, for health care funding, to fight this public health care crisis. So when you have a bunch of white kids taking drugs and dying, many of them, it's a public health crisis. When you have the African American community, it's an epidemic calling for warfare. The last hypothesis is that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware that Michelle Alexander, professor of law in the United States, authored a book called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. And I credit her for having introduced this idea. Basically, the idea is that criminality and ex-felon status have become the new vehicles for the maintenance of white racial privilege. Racism in an age of colorblindness has not disappeared. It has simply been forced underground. How does this work? How has criminal justice become the principal means of enforcing racial differences and maintaining white privilege? It is through this phenomenon of mass incarceration. Over the last 30 years, the US has become the carceral state, or the imprisonment state. Over the last 15 to 20 years, the number of people that we hold behind bars has doubled. Now, even previously, we had the highest rates, or we had very high rates of incarceration as compared to other nations. But we are now the world leader in incarceration, with 2.3 million people behind bars. With 4% of the world's population, we house a quarter of all people in prison globally. We have more prisoners than all 35 leading European countries combined, and proportionally 6 times the number of prisoners that are confined behind bars in China, which is generally considered to have a harsh penal system. A key fact to understand here is that a large majority of our 2.3 million incarcerated individuals are non-violent drug offenders. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 arrests were for simple possession of marijuana, and only 1 in 5 for sales. Indeed, 80% of the growth in drug arrests in the 1990s was for marijuana, which our Department of Health considers less harmful to health than tobacco, which is legal, as you know, at least in our country. So you may ask, how could putting roughly 1.4 million people of color, that's 60% of 2.3 million, how could putting that number of people of color behind bars maintain white privilege? Does that make any sense? After all, blacks and Latinos together in the United States number just shy of 90 million. So, you know, this seems like a relatively trivial number of people. Well, there are several responses to this. So first of all, it's not enough to just count people in jail. There are many others who are under penal control, particularly probation and parole. Probation and parole are conditions or periods of conditional liberty in which a person is out in the community but is under threat of return to custody if conditions of parole or probation are violated. And there are 6 million people in the United States under correctional supervision. Now, parole and probation are not as disruptive to life as imprisonment, but still involve many limitations of possibilities. People who are on probation or parole must often report to probation officers or parole officers. They may have to undergo drug testing. They may have to undergo counseling. They can't move to look for a job, etc. There are many limitations on freedom. Many of them have what are called search conditions, meaning that they can be searched without any justification whatsoever at any time of day or night, and therefore are often subject to rearrest. This also, if you only look at the numbers of people in jail or in prison, also does not account for ex-felon status and the associated deprivation of rights often associated. So, for example, a felon cannot apply for federal public housing. Many employers are unwilling to hire people with a felony record. And studies have estimated that the net impact of felon status is a 40% reduction in income over a lifetime. Voting rights of felons may be taken away by the states. In fact, in 23 states in 2016 disenfranchised, that means took the vote away from at least 5% of their African American adults of voting age. And in some states that number was as high as 20%, in the state of Florida, for example. Nationwide, there are 6.1 million people in total who have been disenfranchised. And these laws, by the way, were mostly instituted during the era of Jim Crow and for the explicit purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. Listen to this statement by a white politician in the state of Virginia in 1902, who described the imposition or the disenfranchisement of felons in the following terms. He said, this was to eliminate the darky being, of course, a pejorative term for African American, eliminate the darky as a political factor in this state in less than 5 years, so that in no single county in the Commonwealth will there be the least concern felt for the complete supremacy of the white race in government affairs. The only looking at the incarcerated also does not consider the spillover effects on families. Partly this is about, that is the impact when a family member is incarcerated. Partly it's about poverty and the disruption of the family economy. You've lost a wage earner. There are costs associated with visiting, traveling to visit people. Two sociologists from Villanova University argue that 5 million people were forced below the poverty rate by incarceration. It's also about unhealthy social dynamics. Most inmates are men, so that communities are skewed. In Washington, D.C., our national capital, there are 6 African American men for every 10 African American women. Public health experts have noted a correlation between rising incarceration rates and higher teen pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. And they speculate that this may be because women have less power to practice safe sex or to insist that their partners remain monogamous when there are 10 women for 6 men. It places men in a position of power vis-a-vis women. There are a number of studies that show that children of people who are incarcerated are more likely to be incarcerated themselves. Boys who are left fatherless become more physically aggressive. 1 in 4 African American kids has had a parent in jail at some point in his or her life. So this is a self-perpetuating dynamic into the future. Now, the major point is not that innocent black defendants are being railroaded by a justice system that is seething with white racists. The inequality, instead, is in the fact that white people who use drugs at similar rates to people of color, and because the white population is so much bigger than the communities of color, are much greater in absolute numbers, are simply not arrested at all. Now we get to the difficult part of this hypothesis. If this really is the new device for maintaining white supremacy, who is directing this? Can we have racism without racists? That's a tough question. There is increasing evidence, and it certainly has come to light in the last year during our presidential elections and in the aftermath of those elections, that there is an undercurrent of racism that exists that has never gone away, but has simply been shunted out of polite society and elite discourse. So the racists are still there. They just know how to keep their mouths shut. What are they getting out of this? What is the form of white benefit? Well, one phrase that sums up part of it is the prison industrial complex. We're talking about the construction of prisons, the administration of prisons, and most of these prisons that have been built over the last several decades are based in white rural communities, which, as you know, have otherwise suffered economically in many ways in the post-industrial age. This is one of the few sort of beacons of economic success. Many we have gone toward, in many places, the outsourcing, the privatization of probation supervision responsibilities. So probation is often no longer handled by court officers or by public officials, but rather by private corporations. Now, local governments and law enforcement join in this profit motive. And increasingly in the kind of neoliberal state we've moved toward, are funding their own activities, supporting themselves through fines and court fees and civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture are non-criminal proceedings that permit the authorities, the courts, to take assets, money, cars, whatever, which they believe to be tainted by crime or the fruits of crime, and to seize them even before adjudicating the guilt of the individual, and on standards of proof that are lower than those that are required in a criminal proceeding. The city of Ferguson, Missouri, which you probably have heard about as the site of the killing of Michael Brown and the site of the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, funded its third source of income were the fines and fees that were derived from traffic violations and other minor crimes, fines and fees for other minor crimes. And all of this, of course, is justified by the moral sense that there's nothing wrong with forcing the guilty to internalize the costs of their own misdeeds. If they have to pay court fees, if they have to pay fines, if they have to pay for drug testing, if they have to pay for probation costs, that's the consequence of their own bad behavior. And in a time of tightened resources, there's nothing wrong with that. There's also electoral advantage. Deliberate elite manipulation of popular sentiment among lower class whites was perfectly evident in the Trump campaign. The mass incarceration also promotes the maintenance of segregation, the substantial separation of communities, African American communities, people of color communities, and white communities by different means. It's no longer permissible by law to segregate. But penal supervision essentially keeps people in their place, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. It keeps them socially and spatially locked into wherever they came from. It is also possible that mass incarceration isn't so much anyone's conscious strategy. Rather, it may give rise to give vent to subconscious feelings of fear and hostility toward blacks and Latinos, and gives an acceptable expression of those feelings in this era of colorblindness, while having the incidental effect of preserving white privilege. So black defendants are out of sight, out of mind, and the form of contemporary American racism is more like indifference or lack of empathy than outright hostility. In sum, we might say that mass incarceration has reproduced most of the advantages of white supremacy without the ideological and moral baggage of previously overtly racist structures and ideologies. So we can have our racist cake and eat it too. I'm getting toward the end. Good? Okay, good. So why do I find this hypothesis persuasive, this last one, and why do I find it more persuasive than the others? Well, first, instincts tell me that deeply rooted cultural beliefs like racism are very resistant to change. It's not credible to me that by the mere passage of laws, attitudes change. We also have the historical precedent of the transformation of one racial regime, that is to say slavery, into another form in the Jim Crow era. Now, this is not to say that this is like old wine in new bottles. Rather, there is genuine change and possibly even progress. I think we could probably agree, if you study the situation, that as abhorrent, as awful as Jim Crow was, relative to slavery, it was an improvement. And likewise, mass incarceration may be a net improvement over Jim Crow. After all, there are signs of progress, like the election of Barack Obama, or the rise of greater numbers of blacks to middle class status, the prominence of African Americans in entertainment, in greater political power. So the fact of these changes or achievements toward racial equality is not inconsistent with the mass incarceration hypothesis. In fact, the appearance of racial progress for some may contribute to guising the continuance of inequalities for the many. Now, the final part. If this is true, what are the implications? What can we do? First of all, on the implications. Criminal justice, of course, is where the whip meets the flesh. But it is not just of concern to those who directly suffer that pain. The appearance of racial injustice in law enforcement and criminal justice is damaging to our society, my society, and to our legal system as a whole. The explosions of riots and racial violence, often associated with perceptions of unjust verdicts in the criminal cases or in cases against the police, are the best evidence. This is a problem, in other words, that we ignore at our peril. So what then do we do? First of all, the issue needs to be brought out into the open. We have to talk about it, we have to publicize it, we have to make it a part of the public policy debate. I also think that it is appropriate to reorient the focus of the civil rights movement away from affirmative action and toward equal justice in criminal proceedings. That has not been a priority for organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, that was such an important moving force in the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. The ACLU, other American Civil Liberties Union, other organizations like that otherwise look at civil rights really don't focus so much on this issue, but they should. For example, one of the most, I think, consequential changes that could be made would be to our practices of bail. Bail is an amount of money that a person is required to post with the court in order to gain his or her freedom from detention before trial. Rich people, you know, who can afford bail and who can afford to get out of custody have vastly better options in navigating the criminal justice system than those who don't. So bail reform would, to equalize, that is to take money out of the picture and not require the posting of bond pretrial would be an incredible advance. We also need to take measures to end discrimination against ex-felons and to facilitate reentry, such as providing tax breaks for employers who hire them. And of course, quickly restoring voting rights, if not eliminating felon disenfranchisement. We also need to look for alliances where we can and not expect to simply extinguish conscious racism in the short term. There may be, we may find allies, for example, among those who are willing to reassess the fairness of the criminal justice system on other grounds or stemming from different concerns. For example, there has been a movement now afoot for 20 to 25 years, which is based on they're called innocence projects. And these are efforts often based at law schools, sometimes NGOs, that basically use DNA evidence in order to overturn wrongful convictions. And DNA evidence has been extremely useful in proving conclusively, even to people not inclined to be sympathetic to criminals, that there are a fair number of wrongful convictions in our system. Also, there are concerns from the political right about fiscal conservatism. That is, there are increasing concerns about the impact of spending on incarceration, funding incarceration, that out of purely pragmatic financial concern is a matter of importance for some people on the political right, and I see no reason why not to make alliances with people there who may have completely different motivations, but who may join in some concerted effort. My country has a lot to atone for how it conducts itself in the world. That is, the big world, abroad, outside of our borders. And also for how we have treated our own people, starting with Native Americans, extending to slaves, including immigrants, and now today vis-a-vis communities or peoples of color. In my view, this is not mostly because of a failure of ideals, but rather a failure to live up to our ideals. So correcting this grave problem, this major injustice that really is at the core of our society, would therefore help us to realize ourselves and make us more truly who we want to be. Thank you.
Abre para questões?
Boa noite. Uma pergunta, eu vou formular em... Acho que os tradutores, por favor, qualquer coisa eu explico melhor para o George, mas... Bem, eu estive lá com o George, né, durante um ano, fazendo trabalho de campo, durante meu doutorado de sanduíche em São Francisco, e observando, entre outras coisas, os movimentos sociais de demandas contra a violência policial, né, e particularmente movimento negro derivados do Black Lives Matter. E uma das principais questões que aparecia durante esse período que eu estive lá, e que era uma questão bastante relevante, né, para os ativistas, especificamente em São Francisco, era a questão da gentrificação, né? George mencionou no começo, né, a redução, né, da população negra na cidade de São Francisco, que na década de 70 era de cerca de 25% da população e atualmente está reduzida a 6%, alguns dizem que 4%, enfim. Todo um processo, né, de uma relação, não dentro do sistema de justiça criminal, né, mas do direito à cidade, né, dessa população. Nesse sentido, George, o que eu gostaria de perguntar, que é uma questão que eu venho pensando, considerando o contexto brasileiro, e você nos convidou a fazer os paralelos, né, com o contexto norte-americano. Aqui a gente tem um cenário de que a maioria da população é uma população negra, né, mais de 50%, e que, em relação, né, à escravidão, foi o último país, né, das Américas a ter o regime legal, né, modificado. A escravidão formalmente foi abolida no Brasil em 1888. Né? Então, nesse sentido, uma questão que eu venho pensando, também um pouco refletindo a partir do trabalho do professor Lenin, é em relação ao racismo em relação com o capitalismo, né? No sentido de pensar como que esse sistema econômico ele foi fundado, né, na desumanização dessas pessoas que vieram, né, para as Américas numa condição de pessoas escravizadas. Né? Então, pensar um pouco como, nesse sistema econômico, né, vamos dizer assim, o lucro original dele foi fundado a partir da condição da objetificação, né, dessas 10 milhões de pessoas que foram trazidas para cá em situação escravizada e que, por sua vez, estruturaram, né, construíram, né, essa fundação, né, desse sistema. E aí, nesse sentido, então, por isso que eu falei a questão da gentrificação, né, um pouco para poder pensar nessa relação. Né, você trouxe essa reflexão dentro do sistema de justiça norte-americano, né, onde a gente se vê a punibilidade desses sujeitos, mas também um pouco dessa reflexão, dessa relação, né, de que o Lenin vem chamando da precarização, né, dessas vidas, e eu venho trabalhando com essa discussão realmente da desumanização, né, desses sujeitos em vida e, bem, também com a morte. Né? Seria um pouco, mais ou menos, umas questões nesse sentido. Assim.
Pode passar, se vai fazer uma questão também. Como é que é seu nome?
Teodoro.
Teodoro.
Eu estudo antropologia aqui na UF. Professor Jorge, o senhor fala sobre uma coisa muito contraditória, né, que é um encarceramento em massa de negros, né, versus uma certa ascensão dos negros nas classes médias americanas. Né, o senhor fala da eleição do Barack Obama, né, e de uma ascensão de uma representação negra na mídia. Enfim, e aí tem essa contradição muito grande. Eu gostaria de te perguntar, porque em 2012, aqui no Brasil, quando foi levado uma forte discussão sobre as políticas de cotas nas universidades públicas, uma das coisas, né, que nos foi dita e que, na minha opinião, se mostra realmente muito promissora e muito potente, são as cotas enquanto um instrumento efetivo de uma promoção de uma igualdade maior, né, entre as pessoas, e, sobretudo, em relação à população negra, que é historicamente destituída de voz ativa e de direitos, né, ou da efetivação dos seus direitos. E aí eu queria perguntar para o senhor se o senhor se sente à vontade para fazer um balanço de como foi os efeitos das políticas de cotas nas universidades americanas, que uma das coisas que nos diziam é que um argumento para defender as cotas no Brasil foi, muito fortemente, os Estados Unidos já têm essa política. Né? Gostaria que o senhor se sentisse à vontade e fizesse um balanço dessa. Muito obrigado.
Teria para mais uma questão, se... Você vai fazer uma questão? Não, se não tem mais ninguém por enquanto, então, George, you may.
Well, Flavia, thank you for this question, and Teodoro also. There's no question, obviously, that African Americans in their forced labor created the capital accumulation in the United States, at least. I'm less familiar with the story here in Brazil. That that enabled the emergence of, of industrial capitalism in the United States. It was, forced labor was a solution to the opportunity in the United States of, vast territorial expansion, but in a time of population scarcity. There, the labor force required to exploit the resources didn't exist until the forced importation of slave labor. And that that labor has played, even following the demise of slavery, played key roles in the further development of U.S. industrial strength. World War II in particular was a period when many African Americans left the South, migrated to places like California, Oakland, where the shipyards, the shipbuilding, Detroit, the auto industry, and many other places. And of course, as a relatively vulnerable and politically disempowered group, was an especially attractive labor pool. What I sense in a place like San Francisco in the contemporary era is that the labor of people of color is less and less necessary, less and less dispensable. Sorry, I meant less and less indispensable. And in fact, it is dispensability that is the characteristic of many communities, like the African American community in San Francisco, and that's part of why its slow forced eviction from the city is not met with significant political opposition. I mean, of course, African Americans themselves haven't been able to resist the forces, the economic forces, and nobody else really cares, I think. So, and I think that dispensability also explains in part the lack of sensitivity of the criminal justice system to the consequences that are born. I don't know why I kept this thing on while I was trying to talk. I was listening to the translation. It was really interesting. Did she get it right or not? Anyway, so I guess there's a uniformity and an arc of continuity through different historical eras in the treatment of African Americans in our changing and evolving capitalist system. But I guess I would be careful not to identify change and distinguish between one era and another, and see that matters change over time. Is that okay? On the question of affirmative action, I'm happy that you asked this question. I teach in a public law school. Hastings College of the Law is part of the University of California. And while we never had a strict quota system as such, we have always had a program called the Legal Educational Opportunity Program. We have always reserved 20% of our incoming class for people who have experienced disadvantage of whatever kind. Racial discrimination, gender discrimination, physical disability, and a variety of other kinds of disadvantage. But we have also, in the state of California, there was a popular referendum passed in 1996. In other words, it was not a law passed by the legislature, but rather one that was put on the ballot after a number of signatures were gained from citizens, and people directly voted on it, and they voted essentially to abolish affirmative action in California public education. And I have seen the consequences, although we never actually practiced the form of affirmative action that was banned. I certainly have seen the change in the nature of our student body at UC Hastings because of the fact that so many of our students come out of the University of California system, which had been practicing affirmative action and was then banned and prevented from doing it. And the consequence is that, I've now taught probably 3 or 4 editions of criminal procedure with not a single African American man in the class, and not many African American women either. So affirmative action is I think a crude, in the form at least of strict racial quotas, is a fairly crude mechanism for achieving equality. But frankly, with its crudeness, it seemed to me, in our experience, to be much more successful than what we are now practicing. So, the downsides of affirmative action are that it sometimes privileges people who are undeserving. There are, in your society, I'm assuming, as in mine, there are well-to-do African Americans who Afro-Brazilians who have had privileges, who have gone to good schools, as younger people, and probably don't need the help. Likewise, there are poor whites, who also suffer disadvantages, different kinds of disadvantages, maybe less severe, but sometimes more severe than their counterparts in the black population. And of course, affirmative action can evoke a reaction, just like it did in my state. Again, California has changed. Its political nature has changed over the last several decades. But probably that that the state of California alone accounted for 4 million votes more for Hillary Clinton than for Donald Trump. So greater than the entire rest of the nation, right? Just in California. So we're not a reactionary state on a lot of issues, but that affirmative action got people animated and hostile, and resulted in the banning of it. So it's ideally, I suppose, you would design a program that takes into account more than strict race. It also takes into class, economic factors, and has more nuance. But if I had to choose between affirmative action, even in its most crude form, and no affirmative action, I would choose affirmative action, based on our experience.
Lenny. O curso de Direito nos Estados Unidos é um curso de pós-graduação, que foi o exemplo que ele deu. Então, não era de cotas na graduação.
George, eu fiquei particularmente interessado, você citou um autor que eu não consegui pegar o sobrenome, Michel alguma coisa, Alexander, não sei, mas você falou sobre a questão do processo de criminalização como um privilégio branco, né? Seria uma maneira dos brancos construírem isso de uma forma privilegiada. Eu fiquei imaginando que isso certamente não tem só a ver com o processo legislativo, mas com todo o conjunto de instituições que atuam nessa construção. E aí eu fiquei pensando o seguinte, eu queria te fazer a pergunta, de que maneira os conflitos, eventuais conflitos e intolerâncias recíprocas entre negros e latinos pode ser apropriada como parte dessa construção, reprodução e usufruto desse privilégio.
Lenny, first of all, to clarify, the name of the author is Michelle, with E-L-L-E, a woman's name, and Michelle Alexander. Yeah. And the book is called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. Now, you were asking about animus between communities of color, between African Brazilians or
Yes.
African Americans and Latinos. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. And your question about that exactly is what? I want to make sure I understand your question. Is it part of this?
A minha questão é imaginar o seguinte, e aí eu falo muito do que a gente percebe, né, como as referências, as maneiras recíprocas de relacionamento entre essas comunidades, que são comunidades, né, que são minoritárias do ponto de vista social, mas que, além de enfrentar, né, cada uma o racismo branco, também se referem umas às outras de maneira discriminatória. E como essas construções, então, elas são apropriadas por essas várias instituições, tá? No sentido de construir esse privilégio branco, essa mesmo, né? Na construção da criminalidade do outro, né? Que pode ser negro ou latino. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it is true that there is considerable racism between communities of color in the United States. Actually, in San Francisco, again, in our famously liberal city, it came to light a couple of years ago that there was an investigation of a police internal investigation that revealed absolutely openly racist text messages going back and forth between various police officers, at least several of whom were Asian, and the disparaging remarks were mostly about African Americans, but also about Latinos. So just to add, you know, that animus also exists in other communities like the Asian community as well. I'm not sure, you know, how much these divisions among people of color who one would think should have interests in common are deliberately amplified and manipulated by powerful people. I can say at least that these divisions have the effect of weakening opposition to white privilege and misdirecting energy that could be part of a resistance, and in a sense releasing pressure in the wrong way, in an unproductive way. So again, while I can't attribute, I'm not sure I see a scheming hand, you know, scheming white hand behind this. It certainly has the effect of benefiting and propping up white supremacy. Yeah.
There's another question. Fred?
Oi, Jorge. Muito obrigado pela palestra. Foi muito interessante e ainda estou pensando em várias questões que você colocou. E aí me veio quero fazer duas provocações para você. Não foi exatamente sobre o que você falou, esse primeiro ponto. Bem, pensando numa comparação rápida com o Brasil, ultimamente a gente tem visto aqui que o número de mulheres encarceradas tem crescido muito. E aí eu queria saber de você, se você está considerando, quando você está falando dos negros, se inclui as mulheres, que aqui tem um número assim muito estrondoso. Então, o aumento, 350% de aumento nos últimos quanto tempo? Nos últimos 10 anos. E também, bem, aqui, né, no Brasil, e especialmente aqui no Rio de Janeiro, a polícia é uma das polícias que mais mata, né? O número de mortes em confrontos com a polícia é muito grande. E aí queria saber se você pode comentar um pouco desse confronto policial, mortes de policiais em confronto, ou de criminosos em confronto com a polícia, lá nos Estados Unidos. Bem, a segunda pergunta é mais difícil, que eu estava pensando aqui quando você falou bem da crise dos opiáceos e pensando também no surgimento da maconha medicinal, né, na última década também lá nos Estados Unidos, que de forma resumida, aí, como você indicou, tanto quem pode usar os opiáceos, que essa crise de opiáceos é que as pessoas estão morrendo de overdose, são os brancos. Como também na maconha medicinal, quem ela foi criada, digamos assim, e quem mais usa a maconha medicinal também é uma classe média branca. Mas quem são os presos, tanto por causa dos opiáceos quanto por causa da maconha, como você colocou, são os brancos, são os negros. Então, eu fico pensando que tem algo a ver aí, não é exatamente com o consumo ou com o consumidor, mas é com quem vende. Então, isso tem a ver com o mercado, algo relacionado ao controle de quem pode vender, quem pode lucrar com esse mercado. Enfim, essa provocação, eu queria ver se você pode falar algo nesse sentido.
Well, thank you, George, for this very interesting presentation. I will make my question in Portuguese. I was wondering, eu estava pensando se fazia, mas vou fazer em português, porque é muito provocativa. Eu gostei muito de ouvir você dizer, na sua análise, que se pode pensar esse encarceramento em massa como uma forma de controle social sobre um grupo populacional específico, se eu entendi bem. E, ao você dizer isso, eu vi exatamente a situação brasileira, e nós aprendemos já há muitos anos com o professor Roberto Cante de Lima, que o sistema penal brasileiro é voltado exatamente para fazer esse controle e essa repressão e esse controle social sobre grupos populacionais específicos. Mas o interessante é que o grande paradigma oposto a esse modelo no trabalho do professor Kant é o sistema norte-americano, que seria uma sociedade mais, no dizer dele, paralelepípedica, enfim, em paralelepípedo, em oposição, na forma de um paralelepípedo, em que a base é similar ao topo, né, a forma geométrica. No Brasil, nós temos uma sociedade piramidal, e um modelo piramidal, depois você se defende, em que os direitos que valem para cima não valem para baixo. Então, quando você traz esse exemplo, eu fiquei, não podia deixar de ficar lembrando desse uso que fazemos paradigmaticamente do modelo americano para comparação com o modelo brasileiro, que é, aparentemente, muito bom para destacar esse uso do sistema criminal no Brasil como uma forma de controle sobre populações específicas. Mas, ao que eu vi da sua fala, nós temos também isso na prática judicial americana. E fico pensando para onde podemos levar isso adiante, o que isso pode nos fazer pensar sobre as especificidades brasileiras. Então, não é tanto uma pergunta especificamente dirigida a você, é mais uma provocação para ouvir como processar isso que você nos traz.
O Kant quer comentar depois, tá? Pode ficar para a próxima?
Bom, eu vou falar em português também. Olha só, tem que naturalmente eu que devo ter me expressado mal esses anos todos né? E a culpa é toda minha, tá bom? Mas eu não digo que a sociedade brasileira e a sociedade americana são, né, representadas por uma pirâmide, um paralelepípedo. Eu digo que a representação que você tem jurídica da sociedade brasileira e da sociedade americana pode ser representada por uma pirâmide e um paralelepípedo, a representação jurídica. E aí é isso que eu acho. Eu tive uma discussão com a professora Sally Moore há muito tempo, quando eu estava fazendo a tese, porque ela propôs uma pergunta um pouco parecida com essa, né? De qual seria a diferença entre representações jurídicas diferentes das coisas, se o efeito era o mesmo, né? Quer dizer, terminava tudo em discriminação e tal, não sei o quê. Então, o que adianta? Eu disse, não, eu não sou um weberiano, mas eu sou o sujeito que acha que as ações humanas são dirigidas a valores, não é isso? E que, se você tem representações fortes, ainda mais que estão juridicamente, né, elaboradas e construídas de uma maneira ou de outra, você vai agir, né, conscientemente, buscando valores jurídicos de uma maneira ou de outra. E é isso que a gente vê hoje na nossa sociedade, né? Quer dizer, a palestra do George é uma palestra de um advogado, né, de um defensor público, ele falou aí, indignado com essa falha, veja bem o que ele falou, essa fraqueza do sistema. Como é que o sistema, que é um sistema paralelepípedico, não consegue dar conta disso. E, pelo contrário, né, como ele terminou a sua própria... Aliás, muito interessante essa ideia, depois posso até falar sobre isso, mas né, serve para, vamos dizer, perpetuar o domínio, né, de uma suposta, porque isso é tudo suposto, né, uma suposta raça branca e tal. Né, como é que pode isso? Porque o sistema não foi feito para isso. Essa é a indignação dos advogados americanos. E, em compensação, do outro lado da cidade, de Gotham City, não é isso? Nós não conseguimos acabar de jeito nenhum com as prerrogativas de função, com foro. Em 2017, que é uma coisa das ordenações filipinas. Então, coisas que estão voltadas para um regime jurídico monárquico absoluto, numa república contemporânea de 2017, de um país que está ligado aos tais BRICS, e não sei o quê, mais uma série de sacanagem, não se consegue fazer isso. E fica uma briga lá entre o Congresso e o Supremo, não é isso? Dessa história de que um engaveta o projeto, aí o Supremo desengaveta o negócio, aí o camarada pede vista para o Congresso resolver, aí vai levar 6 meses e tal, e vai parecer a mesma coisa que aconteceu com a prisão especial, que estava aquele juiz, né, lá de São Paulo, que eu esqueci o nome, que estava, Lalau, isso, estava ganhando regalias, então houve um grande movimento para acabar com a prisão especial, que é outra coisa, não é privilégio de função, é a prisão enquanto o processo está andando, né, tem condições privilegiadas de... Vamos acabar com isso, e não acabaram, e, em 2001, incluíram os militares. Né? Fizeram uma nova lei e incluíram mais mais uma categoria do privilégio. E ficou assim até hoje, há 16 anos que ninguém mexe nisso. Então, quer dizer, nós temos um sistema que se representa desigual. Então, esse sistema se representa desigual, e ele tem mais uma característica, que é diferente do sistema anglo-americano, né? Que nasce com uma representação, olha só o que eu estou dizendo, uma representação né, de que é uma defesa do indivíduo contra o abuso de poder. É uma visão liberal do sistema advogado, quer dizer, que, inclusive, é uma coisa da sociedade, quer dizer, o direito é algo da sociedade, não é uma coisa do Estado. E, aqui no Brasil, o nosso direito nasce colado no Estado, porque as faculdades de direito são criadas para formar quadros para o império, para administrar o império, o legislativo e o executivo. Né? Então, veja bem, ela, desde o começo, o nosso direito estatal, né, brasileiro, é um direito estatal e é um direito desequilibrado, quer dizer, de uma sociedade de desiguais, porque era uma sociedade imperial. E ninguém mais mudou isso, porque esse Código de Processo é de 1870, ele não é de 1940, é de 1870. E o sujeito que fez esse código, chamado João Mendes de Almeida Júnior, diz que o código é tão bom que veio a República e não precisou mudar. Está lá escrito no livro dele de 1920. O código era tão perfeito que veio a República e não houve necessidade de alterá-lo. Está escrito lá. Então, quer dizer, você passa do Império para a República e o processo... Isso que o professor George falou, quer dizer, a questão da justiça criminal é uma questão crítica em qualquer sociedade, porque é onde, como ele diz, onde o chicote, né? Onde o chicote bate, né? Whip hits. Né? É aí que ele bate, que ele prende, que ele mata, que ele condena, etc. E nós somos indiferentes a isso é uma coisa natural. Então, estão os negros todos acusados e mortos, e faz uma onda para cá, faz uma onda para lá, e, no fim, então, fica assim, dá uma reportagem interessante e tudo, mas não... Né? Por outro lado, nos Estados Unidos, isso não só a intervenção do George, mas toda, vamos dizer, a discussão sobre isso, é uma revolta porque o sistema não é. Aqui não é uma revolta porque o sistema está mal, não está cumprindo o seu papel. Não, o sistema está cumprindo o seu papel. O problema é como é que a gente vai trocar esse sistema, se é que é possível trocar o sistema, etc. É outra a discussão muito distinta, né? Então, eu continuo na minha e acho que ele está apontando como é que se diz assim, uma hipótese, né, que ele está levantando, interessante, mas, no caso dele, é horrível, quer dizer, horripilante. É uma coisa que não devia estar acontecendo. Imagina, a supremacia branca usando o sistema para controlar os negros. Isso é uma coisa impensável, né, e tal, o direito da sociedade e tal, não sei o que, porque também os Estados Unidos não são só liberais, né? Isso ele acabou de dizer, que São Francisco era, mas já não é tanto, e tal, mas, ao mesmo tempo, porque votou contra o Trump. Não é? Isso é muito complexo, né? Que nem aqui, essa história é bastante difícil. Mas, no meu caso, eram modelos ideais. Não se esqueça que eu lido com modelos ideais e digo que os modelos ideais não se realizam perfeitamente em nenhum lugar. Modelos jurídicos ideais, não modelos sociais. Isso aí que eu acho que é o barato da coisa. Desculpe, mas eu espero que o meu esclarecimento e a minha culpa por não ter sido claro o suficiente para que, né, o meu colega me entendesse, que agora ficasse um pouco mais claro. E o George pode, né, falar e discordar de mim, aí, ou concordar, ou falar o que ele achar e tal. Mas com você, eu espero ter resolvido o problema.
Eu vou passar para o Jorge, depois tem mais uma pergunta do Felipe Perocan, mas se deixar para lá, tem... Bom, depois tem mais duas perguntas e a gente... Tem três, então depois a gente encerra. Jorge.
It's now been quite a while, but I seem to recall that Fred asked first about incarcerated women. Of course, my discussion pertains to women as well as to men, although the overwhelming majority of incarcerated people in the United States are men, something on the order of 85%. There was a period, particularly in the so-called war on drugs, when the rate of incarceration of black women increased considerably. You know, I don't know if you know the crack. You've heard of crack babies. That is, you know, the whole image of babies who have been born deformed and malnourished and, you know, and the like because of the drug consumption of their mothers. So there was this, you know, there was this common notion of African American women selling their bodies to, you know, to feed their addictions and, you know, sexually transmitted diseases and all of those kinds. It was a horrible, you know, horrible image. And during that period, the incarceration rate of black women increased a great deal. There is some evidence that that as the war on drugs has waned, as it has receded, and it has receded, the incarceration rates of African American women has dropped quickly, even more quickly than that of men. But most of what I said is as applicable to women as to men. You asked about, I know you asked about the crisis of opioids, and I think your question was about how, you know, whether the reaction to it had to do with the, I guess, who was engaged in the production and distribution. In the case of the, you know, the so-called opioid crisis, the distributors are drug manufacturers. And often, apparently, the way the cycle gets triggered is by the prescription of legal painkillers. For example, someone has injured his back on the job at an auto factory and is prescribed opioids to alleviate pain, which leads to addiction, which leads to to eventual consumption of illegal, often stolen sources of drugs and the like. It is conceivable that the mediated reaction to the opioid crisis, I call it mediated because it's the temperate, actually in many ways sensible and compassionate reaction to the crisis, which I wish, I don't have a problem with the treatment of the opioid crisis as a public health crisis. I'm only noting the irony between its treatment as a public health crisis when it implicates the white population substantially, not exclusively, but substantially, and the fact that when drugs were the scourge of the African American community, that was cause for war. If is the difference about distribution could be a factor. I don't sense that's really what it's about. I really think it is about race, if you want to know the honest truth. I think that it's about race and politics. When a lot of these, a lot of the communities that have been struck hardest by the opioid crisis are in so-called red states or Republican-dominated states, and it's the empathy that politicians feel for their constituents and for the ones who vote and elect them is kind of natural. So my own sense is that has more to do with their reaction than who profits from the situation. But I'd be open to further persuasion. I'd be happy to talk about it further. I would, on the sub debate between Danielle and Roberto, my only comment there is, we need. So, Luis mentioned that for the last couple of years, I've been active in promoting scholarly exchanges between people who work on Brazil and other places in Latin America and people who study Palestine. And at several of the meetings and conferences that we've held, we have noted striking similarities between the two places, despite very significant differences in the histories and the structural circumstances of the different communities. I guess I would be. It makes me cautious about seeing too much in a similarity. Phenomena can have different genealogies. Their phenotypical expression can be different despite a different genotype. They can look the same but have different causes. I would be also cautious about drawing too many conclusions about these similarities. I think they always have to be contextualized, and the implications once you have contextualized them, I think, can be quite different, despite the evident similarities.
Vou ler por uma questão de organização. George, você desenvolve uma atividade intelectual sobre o racismo e as instituições jurídicas norte-americanas, mas também tem uma atividade notável como músico de blues. Minha questão é, em que medida esses mundos se encontram? E mais, em que medida a música popular também pode ser um instrumento para repensar o racismo e exercitar o diálogo e a tolerância?
Agora tinha um rapaz lá e depois uma moça. Antes, diz o seu nome, por favor.
Meu nome é Matheus, eu sou de Ciências Sociais aqui da UF.
Tá ótimo.
A minha questão, ela vem a partir de... eu não lembro quem foi que perguntou exatamente, desculpa mesmo. Mas é sobre a questão da diminuição... Foi ela, a menina, aqui, que eu não sei seu nome. Flávia. Ela falou sobre a diminuição da população e alguém falou sobre a questão da violência policial direta, dos homicídios. No Brasil, a gente tem uma questão instituída que se chama os autos de resistência, e isso é algo que é muito utilizado pelos policiais e pela polícia enquanto instituição para justificar e legitimar mortes sem que elas sejam investigadas por outras instâncias. Eu já, em alguns documentários, em algumas leituras, eu percebi que já existiu, enfim, em algum momento se houve investigação de assassinatos ou de excesso de violência com relação à polícia norte-americana em alguns estados, e ainda que essas sentenças tenham sido negativas, né, tenham sido tratadas como inocentes, e isso aconteceu. Essa investigação foi levada à frente. Enquanto no Brasil isso se torna muito difícil justamente por conta dessa instituição e justamente por conta dessa questão de sempre tentar amarrar com que as investigações nem sejam feitas. O que eu gostaria é que, se você pudesse, de tentar traçar paralelos com o que você vê nos Estados Unidos e se existe lá também algum tipo de instituição legal, jurídica, com relação a esse tipo de tentativa de apagamento das investigações.
Boa noite, meu nome é Giane. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta direcionada à questão do encarceramento em massa nos Estados Unidos e a questão racial que foi mencionada, né? As pesquisas têm mostrado que, desde 2009, o encarceramento vem diminuindo nos Estados Unidos, especialmente pela decisão da Suprema Corte, né, de Brown versus Plata, especialmente também pelo impacto da Califórnia na redução desse encarceramento. Então, eu gostaria que, se você pudesse falar um pouco sobre esses programas que foram implementados na Califórnia para a redução do encarceramento, e se existem estudos ou pesquisas que mostram o impacto sobre a questão racial também nessa diminuição do encarceramento, ou se ele está sendo concentrado também da mesma forma que foi o encarceramento em massa. Obrigada.
So, on popular music, well, you know, blues music really was, in the United States, was founded in the African American community. And blues, as you may know, means sadness, more or less. But blues music itself is not sad. It is actually, in my view and in my experience of it, kind of an assertion of life force against bad circumstances, ranging from, you know, being mistreated by a lover to being mistreated by your boss at work. So in a sense, quite honestly, the reason that this particular form of music appealed to me was because I always felt that it was a kind of a mild form of resistance to oppression. I have not myself chosen to deliberately inject a big dose of politics into my music. Most of the time, when I play for people, I assume they want to have a good time and enjoy themselves and go away happy and dance a little bit and that sort of thing. But I do. My music is an expression of my own outlook, and my songs, do have political and social content. Some of them. I have a song about Palestine called "Justice in My Time," which is about not wanting to wait till the hereafter to receive justice, but rather I want it in my lifetime. I have another song that's really sort of expresses the spirit of tolerance and acceptance of different kinds of people doing different kinds of things as long as they don't cause harm to others. I wrote a song called "Take a Knee" recently. I'm not sure if any of you have followed this, but there's an African American football player, again, our kind of football, which I know you don't think of as football at all, fairly. His name is Colin Kaepernick, and he, beginning in the last football season, took a knee. That is, he knelt down during the playing of our national anthem to protest police violence against African Americans. And initially, he was roundly condemned and criticized by everybody, including President Trump. President Trump has criticized him, since last year. But it has sparked a kind of a movement in the United States to, for prominent athletes to take a sort of a more vocal role in politics, and in particular in this issue of police violence against African Americans. And there was a point at which nobody was coming out in favor of his doing this, and so I thought, the least that I can do in my little way is to write a song in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick. So I wrote that song called "Take a Knee." I don't expect that my music is going to affect social change quickly. I think it mostly. I don't know that it would that the music would persuade anybody who doesn't feel already what I'm trying to express. Maybe it piques people's curiosity and makes it possible for maybe people can hear things through music that they can't hear through direct political discourse. But then of course that's just me. There are other people in popular music who have a much higher profile than I do, and I think that their roles can be significant. I think what anytime somebody notable like Colin Kaepernick takes a stand publicly, it makes it more possible for other people to do the same thing. We're seeing that phenomenon these days in all of the revelations of sexual harassment, which have really snowballed, if you know that expression. I don't know. They have snowballed and gathered strength, and many people have been, many women who have suffered harassment have been emboldened to step out. So I think the more prominent people who are willing to take public stands on issues, whether in music, sports, or other popular culture, I think it's helpful. So on Mateus, your question about police violence and the possible differences between Brazil and the United States. Yes, we have a rather poor record. We have a good record of stating that, of establishing legal parameters for the proper use of force by police officers. We have that. Our Supreme Court has laid down laws and principles, and police departments have adopted them. That in no way guarantees their fair application in the streets, and still less does it lead to punishment of police when they do wrong. As you know, a number of prosecutions have been launched in the United States of police who have been involved in these notable shootings in the last several years. So far, I'm aware of none that has resulted in a conviction. Is it positive that we at least make an effort? Yes, I think that's better than not any effort whatsoever. I think it at least puts police on notice that at least they have to hide. They have to make an effort to conceal when they act illegally. And these days, with the ubiquity of cell phones and everybody has a video camera in their pocket, the space, the margin for police getting away with things like that is getting smaller and smaller. So it's a positive direction overall. I wish it could be the same for you here, because despite its shortcomings, I think it's better than what I've observed and what I've read about from Brazil. In terms of reductions in mass incarceration, Jane, is that right, to your question? What has happened over the last, less than a decade is there are several converging trends, I think, and I mentioned a couple of them earlier. There's first of all there are the innocence projects, which are causing, they're providing very concrete evidence of miscarriages of justice. So I think that there's a kind of the innocence projects have caused people to be more willing to question the criminal justice system than previously in a variety of different ways. Much of in California in particular, the drive to reduce incarceration really didn't have that much to do with race as such. It was certainly not presented politically by those who pushed it as about creating racial justice in the state of California. It was about reducing costs of incarceration, and it was about concern over the direction of public funding increasingly into incarceration and away from other things that have been vital to our state, and particularly education. I don't know whether there's evidence which shows that the impact of the reduction has been proportional as between races the way the incarceration was to begin with. I just don't know the answer to that. It might be, hopefully it is. It's a positive trend overall. And like I said earlier, I think people who are concerned about racial justice don't have to convert everybody to our view of things, and there may be others, like people who are concerned about education and about keeping government small. Let them think what they want, as long as the legislation that they pass and the policies that they promote produce an end that we both want.
Bom, gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aqui Um agradecimento muito especial ao George pela excelente palestra, que suscitou quantas questões, e um agradecimento ainda mais especial pela disponibilidade dele ao diálogo. Eu acho que nós devíamos aqui saudá-lo efusivamente, com uma grande salva de palmas. Oi?